Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Yellow Gloves podcast. My name's Chris, and today we're going to look at Cage Warriors 180, which took place on Friday night. I'm recording this on Sunday with a flu, but dedicated and committed to getting this one out. A lot of fun fights to talk about. What a card it was, considering how many fight cancellations we had on this card. We lost Thomas Paul and Orlando Wilson Prince on the day of the fight. Teddy Stringer, Sean Fraser, which was going to be unreal, a real prospect clash there. Adam Cullen, Tobias Harila, which, for all intents and purposes, might have been the most exciting fight on the card. And then we also lost the title fight between Liam Gittins and Shahzad Qadrian. So despite all of the fights dropping off this card, despite it feeling like an absolutely cursed card, we ended up with 11 high quality, fun fights. And not only that, we ended up seeing a lot of upsets on the card, a lot of massive prospects losing in big ways. Obviously, the title switching hands, which might have been a shock to a few. James Webb was the underdog going into this. I personally had Webb as my pick to win, but we'll unpack that in just a minute. But genuinely, what a card it was, an immense amount of finishes, and I can't wait to get stuck into it. So we'll start as we always do with the main event and work our way down. The main event was between James Webb and Andy Clamp. Really, two guys that need no introduction. But if, for whatever reason, you're listening to this with no real knowledge of who either guy is, James Webb, former middleweight champion, a record of 10-5-1, moving up to light heavyweight, debuted in the division back in July and won via decision. Had the chance here in this fight to become one of only a handful of two-weight Cage Warriors champions. James Webb comes into this one with, not a flashy record of 10-5-1, but an absolute legend of UK MMA, an absolute legend in London. Some of his most exciting fights coming in London, and genuine Cage Warriors legend looking to, like I mentioned, hit this feat of becoming one of only a handful of two-weight Cage Warriors champions. Andy Clamp on the other side, 13-2, a real UK MMA veteran. Took him a bit longer than it should have to get to Cage Warriors, but once he did, an absolutely class human being. 2 brain surgeries on this man, somehow still going, somehow still winning titles. Him claiming gold back in March with that knockout win over Matty Byfield, where Clamp was the underdog, is one of the feel good moments of the year. And we came into this fight expecting a fun one. I personally had James Webb winning by knockout around round 2, so I was around late, but I just felt that for how good Clamp is on the ground, I didn't feel that he'd be able to have his way with James Webb on the ground. Webb being also very, very good on the mat. And also, how the fuck was James Webb making middleweight for that long? Look at him in this fight. Look at him in the Baginski fight earlier in the year. There's no how on earth, because even at light heavyweight he looks fucking massive. He was making Andy Clamp look small in there, and Andy Clamp's a giant. It was just a really compelling fight, and it didn't become any less so once it started. Round 1, I scored to James Webb. Loved what he was doing, pressing early on Clamp. Clamp was diving on double legs, but Webb was underhooking, lifting him up, dumping him to the ground. And it was really kind of the story of this fight was James Webb, whenever he had Clamp on the ground, he was dealing significant damage. Whenever Clamp had Webb on the ground, he wasn't really dealing a great amount of strikes or a great amount of impact or even hunting submissions. So it just felt that as much as Clamp was dominating certain positions, Webb with the dominance that Webb had in short spurts, he was putting it on Clamp. And we saw that in round 1. Like I said, I scored it to James Webb. Round 2, we saw James Webb drop Clamp. It looked, initially like perhaps Clamp had just dropped and decided to wrestle out of desperation. But when you saw the replay, absolutely 100% a knockdown for James Webb. Loved the Clamp, even having the presence of mind going for the 2-on-1 on the wrist to stop James Webb from advancing when he was on his back. Some really good grappling sequences in this fight, and we saw that in round 2, towards the end, Webb started to dominate. Clamp kept hunting that single leg throughout the fight, and finally got it towards the end of round 2, but it felt like it was a little too late at that point. And again, another round for James Webb. I had it 20-18 going into round 3. There was some conversation about Clamp's knee perhaps being a bit compromised. So they showed a replay on the broadcast and you could see him buckle a few times on the knee. So perhaps an injury there for Clamp. But in round three, Clamp looked awesome. He came out like a house on fire. This was the round of the night, an absolute beauty of a round. Clamp landing some big shots, Webb managing to slow it down with the clinch, still swinging with Clamp, and it felt like either guy was about to go out. But then Clamp gets Webb down across the fence, tries to pass into Mount, takes the back with the body triangle, but he's too high on Webb and slips off. Then Webb takes his back, but he's too high and slips off. It's a relentless pace. Clamp then eventually gets the body triangle to start attacking the back of Webb. This was just, like I said, two UK MMA legends just going to war in all facets of the game, both trading shots on the feet, both just going at it on the ground and just reversing each other, sweeping each other. It was so much fun. But the most decisive moment of the fight came towards the end of round three when James Webb on the ground manages to take the back of Andy Clamp with about 30 seconds to go and doesn't bother hunting any submissions, just starts smashing Andy Clamp with strike after strike after strike to the head. Felt like Clamp was going to survive, and then you realized he wasn't fighting back. Referee gave him more than enough time to recover, and he just wasn't. He wasn't responding. An amazing, amazing, amazing fight. Genuinely one of the fights of the year in Cage Warriors. I've probably not done it enough justice as a breakdown. It's pretty tough because a lot of it did take place on the ground, and it's always hard to. It's easier to say, oh, this guy hit a right hook and he wobbled his opponent, than oh, this guy was on top of him and then he slipped off. Like, as much as I'm a huge grappling nerd, it's always harder to explain grappling sequences than striking sequences in terms of excitement. But genuinely go back and watch this fight if you haven't, because it was unreal. And James Webb, what a fucking win for him. Almost 5 years to the day where he claimed middleweight gold. He's now the light heavyweight champion at 34 years of age, a bona fide legend of the UK scene. Both men are, don't get me wrong, but James Webb improving to 11-5-1 and now holding on to that title. It's just a feel good moment for the sport. Everything I've ever heard of James Webb is that he's the nicest guy. The work he's done at Team KF is amazing, and you can see the evolution of his game. Such an impressive fighter and just an absolute grinder. One of those people who his record really. We'll talk about someone else on this card whose record really betrays the quality of fighter that he is. That's really the case for James Webb. I had a question from Fabio Onofri who asked, "What's next for Webb?" And the real answer here is that I don't know. You think that, light heavyweight is pretty barren for Cage Warriors. There isn't a great deal of light heavyweight fights. Do you throw in, and this is my personal opinion, do you go super fun, perhaps someone who doesn't have the mileage in the organization, but do you go Charles Joyner, who's been like a knockout machine and who's a really fun, massive, lanky 205er? Do you go for a fun fight like that? I think that's potentially what I'm most interested in all honesty. I think that's the fight for me that I'd really enjoy seeing. Obviously, you've got Darren Stewart has retired. Potentially, that could have been a fight that I guess we'd see. I could see Cage Warriors doing it if he wasn't retired, but genuinely, the 205 division's pretty barren. I wouldn't be surprised if Webb just sits out for a bit. I don't think there's a huge appetite to see fights in that division, in all honesty. Charles Joyner is my pick. That's probably a bit of a rogue pick, but yeah, stick with me on that one because I think Charles Joyner is really fun. And I think on that note, we'll move swiftly onto the co-main event, which we're gonna rattle through a bunch of fights now because these were so much fun. Co-main event: Nik Bagley and Jordy Bakkes. Jordy Bakkes is insanely exciting, and so's Nik Bagley. This was an insane fight for Cage Warriors to put together. Two guys who just love to submit their opponents, two guys who just love to grapple, and two guys who are not afraid to swing in the pocket and smash each other. Jordy Bakkes 6-2, Nik Bagley 5-1. All five of Bagley's wins via submission, and for Bakkes, third degree judo black belt. We last saw him submit Ryan Shelley as an underdog, and for Bagley, just another one of those big GB top team prospects. And we're going to talk a lot about GB top team later on today. It wasn't a fight that lasted very long, in all honesty. These boys were just slugging it out early doors. Bagley used the momentum and the aggression to just kind of chase Backers down against the fence and get him take him down super early with like 30 seconds. He already had Bakkes down, dominated from half guard. Bagley was smashing him from half guard. Eventually got the body triangle in, took the back of Bakkes with 90 seconds to go, striked away at the head of Bakkes, which effectively allowed him to expose the neck and secure the rear naked choke with just seconds left of the first round. The reason this episode is probably going to be really quick is because we had a lot of first round finishes. As much as I'd love to sit here and just chat about Nik Bagley for the next 10 minutes, because you all know he's one of my favorite prospects, in terms of action, there wasn't a great deal because the fight didn't last very long. First round submission for Nik Bagley, who for me is one of the best back attackers in the game right now. We always talk about Jordan Vucenic as one of the best back attackers in MMA. And Nik Bagley is running him very, very close for his money. Nik Bagley 6-1 now, 5-1 in Cage Warriors, with all 5 of his wins via rear naked choke. I keep banging on about GB Top Team, but it's impossible not to. So many gems are coming out of that gym right now. There were so many GB guys who won on this card. And, to save, I probably will have to mention them every once in a while, but I really just want to quickly go off on one about GB Top Team because I tweeted this and I don't know that I'll read it verbatim, but I'll effectively kind of summarize how I felt. But I, what GB Top Team are doing is really, really impressive. What they're doing with their roster of fighters, not just their pro guys, but their amateur guys. It's an incredible gym with legitimately world class coaching. You got obviously Brad Pickett and Ashley Grimshaw, who we see all the time. You've also got Mike Ekundayo in their former Cage Warriors fighter, but also coaching at GB Top Team now. Just it might not feel that way yet. Me saying world class when most people turn around and say, "Oh, but who are their champions? Where are their champions?" It's coming, trust me. And once it hits, it's going to be an absolute takeover. We've got Next Gen MMA in the UK who are doing incredible things, and Team Renegade as well. These guys are getting accolades and they're doing it on the biggest stages. I think GB Top Team, obviously a younger gym. I think once they get to the top, they are not going to relent. Absolute trailblazers, and what they're doing with their fighters. Nik Bagley's just one of many, right? We'll talk about Giovanni Scott later. We'll talk about Weslley Maia in just a few minutes. What they're doing with their fighters, even the guys coming up, right? Even the guys who are making their pro debuts, they are creating monsters at that gym, and not just monsters in terms of what they're doing in the cage, but just the mentality of their fighters. They're creating not only guys who are technically sound, but also are grinders, have this really bulletproof mentality, and it just goes down to the coaching. So, yeah, I wanted to go off on that one. Perhaps not talking too much about Nik Bagley, but GB Top Team as a whole. But to go back to Bagley, 6-1 now. I think in the next 2 years, we'll probably see Bagley, if not in a title picture, perhaps not even in Cage Wars anymore. I could see him getting a contender series shot. He's so exciting. He's great on the mic as well. I know you don't see it a great deal in Cage Wars because they don't do the post-fight interviews in the cage, but if you see any of his interviews, even if you see his face-offs, the guy's a lot of fun and he fights like it too. The guy fights like people owe him money, and that's a great trait to have. So Nik Bagley, 6-1 now. Cannot wait to see what they do with him next. Paddy McCorry returned to the yellow gloves after a run in The Ultimate Fighter where he lost in the semi-final, I believe. A 4-1 record outside of The Ultimate Fighter, scored 2 immense finishes in 2023, one of which I had on my shortlist for finish of the year last year, which was his flying knee on Angus Hewitt. His opponent here, Ty Palmer, 6-7. In all honesty, a warm body for McCorry to style on, and that's exactly how it went. 6-7, Palmer is 6 of his 7 losses via finish, and making his Cage Warriors debut. It went exactly how I thought it would. Again, not a great deal to talk about in this fight because it ended within the first minute. McCorry landing a right hand straight to the temple of Ty Palmer. One shot, walk off KO inside a minute. The way that Palmer fell reminded me of Jamal Hill versus Johnny Walker. The fight went exactly as it should have. Easy as you like for Paddy McCorry, who is now 5-1 after a stint in the tough house. We'll answer 2 questions here because NDH 330 asks, what's next for Paddy? Title shot or one more tune-up? And Fabio Onofre also asks, is Paddy McCorry the number 1 contender at middleweight? The reason I'm pairing both these questions up is not just because they relate to Paddy McCorry, but also because they are effectively asking the exact same thing. What's next for Paddy McCorry? Does Paddy McCorry fight for a belt next? The answer here, at least for me, is that I don't think that Paddy McCorry should be fighting for the title next. What I do want to see is the next fight. Middleweight is interesting, right? Like we need someone to fight Belandi. We need people to fight Belandi. And in all honesty, Belandi and McCorry, I wouldn't put it past McCorry being able to win that fight. However, it's quite unclear to me that there's a genuine contender in this weight class. What I would love to see, in all honesty, what I'd love to see is if we could bring back Matt Bonner. I know this is again me just being an absolute hipster. If we could bring back Matt Bonner and have Paddy McCorry fight Bonner, just the thing is McCorry's beaten people. I want to see him fight a former champion. I want to see him fight someone who is dangerous still, someone who is well rounded. I think Bonner would be a great opponent, someone who's got 27 pro fights, would be the most experienced opponent that Paddy McCorry's ever fought. You could definitely go and throw McCorry in there. I wouldn't complain. I just think that Will Curry, for me, should be the person who fights Belandi next. It just makes the most sense. Obviously, he lost in Contender Series, but in Cage Warriors, he's on a 3-fight win streak since losing in the title match against Mick Stanton. I also, personally, this might be a bit, again, of a hipster pick. We've seen Naglis Kanasauskas lose to the champion, Dario Belandi, back in 2023. He's on a 2-fight win streak. What I would do personally is I would do Will Curry, Dario Belandi, and then I would do, if you can't get Matt Bonner back, because obviously he's in other promotions now, if you can't get Matt Bonner back for McCorry, perhaps you do Naglis Kanasauskas versus Paddy McCorry. You make that your number one contender fight. It's guaranteed violence. Two guys who love to just swing in the pocket and two guys who are very well rounded. For me, that's what you do at middleweight. But I'd be interested to hear how you folks feel. So if you want, tweet me, DM me, message me on Instagram. What would you do with the middleweight picture? Is Paddy McCorry the number one contender at middleweight? Again, I've got no issues with that. If it is Paddy, I'd watch that till my eyeballs fall off, right? Like they could do it in Dublin, they could do it in Rome. It makes perfect sense. I just think that Will Curry, with the story that's there for Will, the fact he's beat Leon Aliou last year, earlier in the year, there's a story there that you can flip. You do it in Rome behind enemy lines. That's probably the fight for me, Will Curry and Dario Belandi. But if McCorry's next, McCorry's next. But how good would McCorry versus Naglis Kanasauskas be? Think of that one as well, guys, because I think that would be a banger. Swiftly moving on, we had the People's main event, which was between Weslley Maia and Alexander Loof. Look, I don't need to. Do I need to introduce this? I'm gonna introduce it anyways, just because we always do it. Love coming off his split decision loss to Qadrian in the prizefighter final back in July. Maia also coming off a loss to Qadrian in the prizefighter back in July. 9-6 record for Maia, but like we spoke about earlier, this is a record that definitely betrays the quality of fighter that Maia is. Luf 7-2 really needs no introduction. An absolute banger out of Vasteras Fight Club in Sweden. Just an absolute machine of a man. And Maia, again, we don't need to introduce Maia. One of my favorite fighters in Cage Warriors. Both of these guys are. So to see them face off, I was expecting fireworks. And I wouldn't say that I got fireworks. What I got was a total one-sided beatdown domination in one round from Weslley Maia. I personally picked Maia to win this fight. I had him to win via decision. I thought that the grappling would be too much for Loof late. I predicted that Loof would probably hurt Maia early, and then Maia would recover and just lean on his wrestling, and it would be just like a back and forth banger between the two guys. What we got instead, like I said, was just total domination from Weslley Maia. Probably the best win of his career. I guess the win he had in PFL was pretty massive, because Evans is an undefeated, or was an undefeated prospect coming into it. But this for me, I think, is more meaningful for Maia, and I think positions him very well in that once Gittins and Qadrian, once that is wrapped up as a title fight, Maia's got to be the next guy. Trilogy with Qadrian is one of the biggest fights Cage Warriors could put on right now. One of the most compelling fights they could put on right now. Imagine that across 5 rounds. It would be so fucking good. And obviously, Maia against Gittins as well would be sensational. But in terms of this fight, it was really, yeah, 1 round beatdown. Maia chopping the lead leg of Loof early, really undeterred by Loof's punching power, which was kind of scary to see, but also was exactly the game plan. Loved the knee off the frame from Loof to try and dissuade Maia from taking him down. But then Maia just relentless, entered on another double leg, managed to take Loof down, side control, transitions beautifully to the back of Loof, landed some nice elbows to get his arm under the jaw of Loof, who initially defended the rear naked choke really well and managed to get Maia off his back. But Maia found his way to get back there. And again, elbow in, elbow in, elbow in, opened Loof up with the body triangle. So if you watch the sequence, he's got the body triangle in. He kind of shifts his hip to one side just to give a bit more elevation, and that opens Luff up immediately for him to really sink the body triangle in tight and get his arm under the neck of the Swede to score a beautiful first round rear naked choke. Like I said, man, Weslley Maia is special, and it's crazy, right? His record is 10-6. If I went up to someone and I was like, "This guy is one of the best fighters in Europe. He's 10-6," people would look at me and be like, "Okay, like that's bullshit." But you this is the problem, right? Like with a lot of MMA fans, they only watch the UFC, and with combat sports in general, all we do is we tend to obsess over these perfect records. Guys who are, oh, this guy's 14-1, this guy's 17-0. There's guys who are 10-6. So you don't know their story, right? Like Maia started fighting really young. Two of his losses are via injury, right? If you now look, if you take those two away for whatever reason, right? Oh, he's now 10-4. Is that more appealing? If he started fighting a bit later, if he joined GB top team a bit earlier in his career, what if he was 12-2? Because this is for me one of the best fighters in Europe right now, Weslley Maia, and he's been putting in the work. And GB top team have completely revolutionized this game over the last few years to destroy Alexander Loof in the way he did, to be competitive with Qadrian the way he was, to also have a win over Qadrian, who, for all intents and purposes, for a lot of people, is a champion in the weight-in, right? A lot of people think that he's going to go in there against Gittins and get the job done. Maia is that guy, and this win perfectly solidifies that. To do what he did to Alexander Loof in 1 round, we've never seen anyone do Alexander Loof like that. It took Luke Riley 3 rounds to get Alexander Loof out of there. Obviously, not comparing, but you know what I mean. It's not easy to get Alexander Loof out of a fight, and Weslley Maia made it look so. I can't wait to see what they do next with Maia. I hope he sits to the side for a bit, let the Gittins and Qadrian fight play out, and if it is Qadrian, boy, that trilogy is one of the best fights that Cage Warriors could put on right now. I would pay a lot of money to see that one. Elsewhere on the main card, we had Giovanni Fernandez versus Jimmy Quinn. Giovanni Fernandez making his Cage Warriors debut here, 2-2 record with a really cool link to Cage Warriors. His uncle, Emmanuel Fernandez, former Cage Warriors champion, and his father, a former fighter in Cage Warriors as well. Emmanuel Fernandez was the first French Cage Warriors champion, of which there's been five, I believe, 5 or 6. I tweeted about it on the day of the card. It's a pretty cool link that Giovanni Fernandez has to French MMA and to French Cage Warriors lineage. Against Jimmy Quinn here, Jimmy Quinn, the human highlight reel, owner of the fastest Cage Warriors knockout of all time, 3-1 as a pro, 10 fights in total, and he's never seen a scorecard. That's including the amateur ranks. Coming off back-to-back finishes in 2024 after his shock defeat last year to Tom Wright. This one was unbelievable for as long as it lasted. Jimmy Quinn just looked tremendous early, and Fernandez showed an unbelievable amount of grit to survive that first round. I scored it 10-8 for Jimmy Quinn, landing big shots from the mount, massive right hands, the left hook to the body. Every time Fernandez would get wobbled or would get hurt, he'd manage to clinch up. And Jimmy Quinn on the ground was dominating him as well, landing these nasty, crushing elbows that you could hear. You could hear Fernandez's head just bouncing off the canvas. But the kid managed to survive somehow as Jimmy Quinn put the boots to him in round one. I had it 10-8 Jimmy Quinn. very clear, a really fun round, but it looked like Fernandez was just waiting to get put out and put to sleep. But in the second round, as early as it starts, it finishes. Giovanni Fernandez with one of the comebacks of the year, clocking Jimmy Quinn with the first strike of the round. Jimmy Quinn wrestling up against the fence, taking Fernandez down with the body lock takedown. Fernandez pops right back up, takes Quinn down himself. Fernandez then takes the back and chokes Jimmy Quinn out. An unreal display of grit. And when I spoke about massive upsets on this card, you could say James Webb was an upset. I picked Webb to win. This one was a genuine upset because I didn't know a great deal about Giovanni Fernandez, and I thought this was someone that Jimmy Quinn would be able to put the boots to, and it looked like that early. But when a fighter displays that much heart, that much grit, and they manage to pull the win out of nowhere and finish their opponent when they were on the cusp themselves of getting finished, this is someone to keep an eye on. Giovanni Fernandez. I'm immediately invested in this dude's career. What a fight that was, and that's one of the comebacks of the year. It's right up there with the Mitchell Good buggy choke from earlier in the year. This is this was special. So Giovanni Fernandez improving to 3-2. I hope that Cage Warriors match him up again soon. Obviously, let him recover as well, but he needs to be in there soon because I think there's a lot of fun fights for this guy at bantamweight. I wouldn't tire from watching him fight. In terms of Jimmy Quinn, obviously it's another loss for him after coming to the scene and getting that, with your pro debut to finish a fight in 10 seconds is insane. And Jimmy Quinn, look, he's going to be like this his whole career. I don't think there's any I don't think there's any scenario where Jimmy Quinn scales back his game and fights less aggressively and less flashy. And if he does, you kind of lose what's special about Jimmy Quinn. I don't think that Quinn is going to be a guy who we're going to see in many title fights, and we're going to see him pushing the pace and fighting these top tier guys anytime soon. But in terms of being an entertainer and just being someone that you tune in for, Jimmy Quinn will always be that and will continue to be that. But the spoils all go to Giovanni Fernandez. Incredible comeback win. Cannot wait to see what Cage Warriors do with him next. The main card opener was between Yusuf Nazakatov and Cameron Stewart. Cameron Stewart was really the story coming into this fight. A very highly touted prospect in the UK, 7-2 amateur, making his pro debut, former lightweight champion in the Cage Warriors Academy scene. And Nazakatov really going under the radar coming into this one. Record of 1-1, making his Cage Warriors debut. Won his first ever fight, which was in Bellator via heel hook in 2021, and hadn't won a fight since. So that's 3 years without tasting victory. Obviously, he's only ever had one fight after that Bellator one, but it's a long time to not taste victory. And Cameron Stewart was a pretty sizable favorite coming into this fight. And for me, I gave him round one, Cameron Stewart. I thought that it was a fairly close round, but most of the damaging stuff that happened came from Cameron Stewart in round one. But what we saw in rounds 2 and 3 was just an immense display of distance management, range management, and just patience from Yusuf Nazakatov, who I scored the last two rounds to. I scored it 29-28 to him. He slowed the fight down to the pace he wanted it to be on the feet, landed the better shots, and really picked Cameron Stewart apart. I think Cameron Stewart in round one had a moment where towards the end, he took Nazakatov's back, and I think he really tired himself out doing it. And Nazakatov was just landing at a better clip throughout the fight, had a really clean, beautiful jab that he was fighting off of. And every time he decided to let his hands go, Nazakatov, it landed. Stewart was very much frozen for a lot of the fight. And it's easy to sit here and be like, oh, he was frozen, he was tired. I don't mean that to say that he's excused, like that these are excuses, right? He's frozen and he's tired because of Nazakatov. I think Nazakatov's footwork is what froze Cameron Stewart. Cameron Stewart didn't know when to go, didn't know when to, trigger his next strike because Nazakatov was throwing these not awkward pace strikes, but like he was fighting at a different pace than I think Cameron Stewart expected, and I think that threw him off massively. For me, that's one of the best debut performances you'll see in Cage Warriors this year because Cameron Stewart is legit as hell. And Nazakatov really put it to him in those last two rounds, scored it 29-28 to him. I'm really excited to see what Cage Warriors do with Nazakatov next because there's a really good fighter in there, someone who is equally adept on the ground as on the feet, someone who has a really good personality. I was watching interviews with the guy, super confident, and he believed wholeheartedly that he was going to come in here and beat Cameron Stewart, and he did exactly that. Huge, massive underdog win. Two in a row we had there with obviously Giovanni Fernandez and Nazakatov, and it really sums up that this card was all about the upsets. And that's another one. Probably not an upset in the eyes of Nazakatov and his camp, but the general UK MMA scene. I think a lot of people were expecting Cameron Stewart to win. So props to Nazakatov. That's exactly what you do. You come in as an underdog. You show no signs of backing up. Okay, you drop the first round, but round 2 and 3, you really show people what you're about, and you come out of this looking like the man. So props to him, and I cannot wait to see him in action again. We'll move on now to the prelims. We'll start with the prelim headliner, and we'll work our way down. Quite a few fights to talk about, but a lot of finishes and a lot of exciting shit that happened. We'll start with Tarek Pell versus Danny Blundell. Tarek Pell, I always, you guys know, I'll always lay my cards early when I'm talking about fighters. If I've got certain biases or certain allegiances, I'll put it out there. And look, Tarek Pell is someone I've followed since the amateur ranks, someone who I think is not only a great striker, as we've seen in Cage Warriors as a pro, and we'll talk about that shortly, someone who I think has really underrated ground game as well. Pell's just one of my favorite fighters, and also, someone who listens to the podcast and someone who has been very supportive of the podcast in the past. So, I'm always down for a Tarek Pell fight. And, he comes into this coming off his first professional loss to Sean Fraser, where I thought he took the third round, but rounds 1 and 2 were definitely Fraser's rounds. And it was one of those where Ian Dean, the matchmaker, will just put two prospects together and just let them figure it out. No shame in losing to Sean Fraser. Fraser's one of the top prospects in the UK right now. But Pell debuted in Cage Warriors with a 22-second knockout, so comes into this fight 3-1 as a pro, 7-2 as an amateur. Blundell on the other side, making his Cage Warriors debut, was originally supposed to fight Adam Darby here. So worth mentioning, Tarek Pell's coming into this fight against his most experienced opponent on less than 2 weeks' notice. And I think that should play into this as well because though Tarek Pell's a favourite in this fight, I think, in my opinion, he was. I don't know what the betting lines were saying, but it's still tough to come in against a guy who's had almost 10 pro fights when Pell's not really fought someone with that amount of fights. I know his debut, he did fight someone who'd already had 10 fights, but Blundell's fought at a higher level, basically. So upper weight class as well. This one taking place at 170. Easy to forget, but Tarek Pell is a lightweight. He looked massive in there, and this fight lasted not very long. It was a total domination from Tarek Pell from start to finish in the first round. You saw immediately, we'll talk about the finishing sequence, but there's no surprise to me that Tarek Pell finished Blundell in the way he did, because what we saw early, one of Tarek Pell's first strikes was the front kick, had the stance switch as well as forcing Blundell backwards, but the front kick is key because he was firing that all round long. Blundell did manage to bust Pell open a bit on the nose, but Pell was just landing the better strikes overall. I don't really know what exactly managed to crack Pell on the nose, but he was definitely leaking there, which is always kind of a fun thing when you start to see all that blood, but you see a guy pull through it and win, and then you get all the sick pictures afterwards of like them celebrating and their faces all bloodied. But Pell looked brilliant here. Took that damage, however which way it was dealt. It didn't seem like it was bothering him. The commentary were like, "Oh, he's breathing a lot out of his mouth, potentially a broken nose." I don't think there was anything like that. I think just some fighters breathe out of their mouth, and we look into it a bit too much, in my opinion. But Pell drops Blundell late in the round with a gorgeous right hand. Blundell does brilliantly to like attack the heel hook to force Pell off of him. I thought that was pretty good, especially when you've just been rocked. But Pell jumped in with more strikes, landed a really nice knee to Blundell while he was grounded. When they were back on the feet, remember we spoke about the front kick just a minute ago. It's the way that Pell manages to get the finish here. He gets that right front kick to the body with his toes. That's straight toes to the midsection, which if you've ever been kicked in any kickboxing or any karate or anything like that, when it's the toes into the liver, it's the toes to the solar plexus. That is something that will shut down any human being on this planet. I don't care who you are. And it was enough to shut down Blundell. Walk off body shot KO, just a stunning finish for Pell to return to the win column. And I'll just get nerdy here for a sec because you guys know I'm a kickboxing guy. Um, that that front kick, which is like it's calling it a front kick, but it's more of like the snap kick. It's like a 45-degree angle. It's got that Kyokushin. Now, I tweeted this after the fight, but there was like anyone who watches Japanese kickboxing, that was Yuki Yoza-esque. He's got that Kyokushin kicking vibe to him, and that finish was pure dirt. Like one of the best finishes of the year. It's in my shortlist for finish of the year. I don't know that it will win because we've had some crazy ones, but it's right there. Tarek Pell though improves to 4-1 now. Keep following his story, guys. Keep following his career. For me, he's one of the best prospects in the UK at lightweight, and clearly we should consider him at welterweight too because he looked perfectly fine at 170 and stepping in on short notice against a more experienced opponent. He managed to put it to Blundell in a wicked way. Amazing finish, and hopefully Cage Warriors will be matching him up nice and early for 2025. The next fight we'll talk about is Davide Scarano versus Giovanni Scott. Scott 5-1, coming off a fight of the year contender with Jer Harris. Super close competitive fight between two massive prospects. Scarano, always fun in Cage Warriors, 5-2 record, but 1-2 in the promotion. Last time we saw him, he scored a huge underdog win in July when he subbed Fran Breen in round one. This guy's BJJ is off the charts. Giovanni Scott, though, what a performance from him in this fight. I scored it 30-26 to Giovanni Scott, who improves to 6-1. One of the best prospects in the UK. Forget flyweight, just in general, one of the best guys. Took some time out of MMA, did the boxing. He's back now. Just a bona fide future champion, in my opinion. I'd put him right in there. Like once Shaj and LeBlond get their business done, I have no issues with Giovanni Scott being the next man in line. He was sensational in this fight. Scarano definitely game, but just managed to pull through with just a brilliant chin because Giovanni Scott put the boots to him. You want to see a clean jab. You want to see one of the best jabs we saw all night. Go watch the performance of Giovanni Scott. I've always tweeted this, right? Like Giovanni Scott's just got one of the cleanest jabs you'll see. And in this fight, we definitely saw that. Scarano had no real answer. Giovanni was throwing that jab, disrupting the momentum of Scarano, stopping him from committing to multiple strikes because the jab was always in his face whenever he was trying to trigger more than 2 or 3 punches and trying to string them together. His boxing was way too much for Scarano. Every time Scarano wrestled with Scott, and this is why I rate Giovanni Scott so much, it's not just the boxing. Every time this guy hits the mat, doesn't matter who it is, go watch the Joe Harris fight. You take this guy to the ground, he will not take a second to rest. A lot of fighters will take that moment, they hit the ground, okay, I'll figure this out, I'll close my guard, I'll figure out what I'm going to do next. And you can see them processing their next moves. I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do, but Giovanni Scott, he hits the ground and he's like, how the fuck do I get back up within the next 2 seconds? And I think it's that, we spoke about GB Top Team earlier. I think that's the mentality they instill in their fighters. Weslley Maia is the same thing. Go watch Nathaniel Wood. Go watch any of their guys. These guys hit the mat. If they don't want to be on the mat, they will pop right back up. It doesn't matter who's got them down. They will try their hardest to pop right back up. And Scarano, who like I said, his BJJ is unreal. The guy's a seriously good grappler. Giovanni Scott just made it look like he was just an average guy taking him down. Every time Giovanni hit the mat, right back up he came, popped right back up. And it was great to see a real proper all-round performance. Scored it 30-26, like I said, the reason being that Scarano had a point deduction for grabbing the fence 5 times. It was definitely a lot more. I counted a lot more, but I think that the broadcast mentioned 5 times, so we'll stick with that as the official amount of times Scarano held it, but it looked like it was happening way more, and you could see the frustration in Giovanni's corner, and rightly so. And the referee had to deduct a point, and I'm glad he did. But I think it was poorly officiated up until that point because he was warned, but he kept getting away with it. But for Giovanni Scott, my word, what a fighter! What a year he's had! Genuinely an insane year. On my shortlist for Fighter of the Year. Like I said, this award tends to go to people who have won titles or naturally have done something very special. I don't think Giovanni Scott will win my Fighter of the Year, but the fact he's nominated, despite only being 6-1, despite being so young in his career, that's a massive sign. Giovanni Scott is, in my opinion, Cage Warriors champion in the next 12 to 18 months. You can quote me on that. This is a podcast, so it's out there for the world to hear. That's my massive prediction for 2025. We might see Giovanni Scott holding the belt, and if not early 2026, it's his, unless the UFC come calling. We'll talk about another huge upset on this card. Richard Kallos versus Tommy Brunning. Richard Kallos scoring the sickest belly down armbar submission on Tommy Brunning. Kallos, a massive underdog coming into this fight. 3 years since his last fight, making his Cage Warriors debut. Tommy Brunning needs no introduction. Champ in the Cage Warriors Academy scene as an amateur. 1-1 record as a pro, coming off a shock loss at the time to George Grozav back in July. Grozav very legit though, as we'd come to know, but Brunning was a huge favourite coming into this, pushing the pace early with a combination of strikes, getting the takedown from a really nice throw. But Kallos immediately, this is someone who knows how to play with someone when they're in their guard, right? Like Kallos cutting the angle off on the bottom. I tweeted this during the fight, but the shoulder crunch as well, I think was a really nice key detail in the fight. Managing to isolate the arm with the shoulder crunch allowed him that moment to just bring his hips up and take them off the center and throw his hips into that armbar. It was an immense setup, and then a belly down armbar is always gross to see because you know that's just that arm's gonna go within a split second. It's a crazy win for Richard Kallos, who improves to 3-2. Like I said, first fight in 3 years, has an amateur win over Nathan Fletcher as well, UFC's own Nathan Fletcher, and former Cage Warriors fighter Nathan Fletcher. So clearly a guy, we're talking a lot on this card about records betraying how good a fighter is. Perhaps 3-2 isn't the sexiest record for a lot of people, but Richard Kallos clearly a high quality operator and an opportunist on the ground. One of the best finishes of the night and a huge underdog win. Tommy Brunning, I think with Brunning, he's you all know how highly I rate him. I think he just needs to probably tone down the aggression in his fights. I think he's going into fights trying to blow people out of the water, and it's similar to Jimmy Quinn, where I think Jimmy Quinn has the speed and explosiveness to see him through. I don't think Brunning has the same thing. But what Brunning has is I think he's a stronger, more dominant fighter than Jimmy Quinn. So I think Brunning can scale back his game without any impact really. Whereas I think Quinn needs to continue being just that fast, speedy, explosive, exciting guy. And I think Brunning can really scale it back, lean more on his grappling. He's got a really good chin, does Brunning. He can take damage. Doesn't mean he has to just always go in, get people down, and just start dogfighting them. I think he can probably be a bit more patient. But this is what you get when guys are 3 fights into their career. This is what happens. You don't always get to the 3-0. You don't always have that clean, uh, 3 knockouts in a row, 3 submissions in a row. Sometimes you've got to learn as well. And I think that's what Brunning's encountering. But Richard Kallos, the night belongs to him. What a finish. We're going to cover Joe Ambler versus Joshua on Wardy, but not to great detail because in a card that was, spiced up with so many great finishes and so much excitement, this fight was a real dud. I picked on Wardy to win and he got the business done 30-27. A pretty forgettable fight, but Wardy dominated the grappling, dealt the better strikes on the ground when he had Ambler down. Ambler dominated a lot of positions, but didn't do a great deal with them. I did tweet that I think I'm a massive Wardy guy. He's 5-5. I think he's had a really tough career. He's fought some crazy level of opposition as well. I think he looked a bit compromised in this fight. I don't know if he had an injury, like a foot injury or something that was impeding his movement, but the footwork looked off for Onwardy, in my opinion. If I'm wrong, then I'm wrong, and maybe it was just a tough fight for him. But he looked a bit different. Like when he was pressing forward, he was keeping his hands down, and it seemed like he was carrying a lot of weight on his feet. He wasn't shifting like he usually does, but it was enough to get the business done. I'm happy to see Onwardy now with a positive record of 6-5. As for Ambler, I think second Cage Warriors appearance here, very strong amateur career, but a tough start to the pros here. 1-3 is Ambler now as a pro. I hope they give him another opportunity and try and match him up against someone less experienced than Onwardy, and someone not like Chamu who's gonna try and take your neck or take your head off. So yeah, I hope they give Ambler another chance. As for Onwardy, nice to see him back in there. Nice to see him getting a win. Wasn't his greatest performance, but I think he'll take it. So the final fight we'll talk about, which is the prelim opener, is between Marco Sarasiavi and Callum Hoyen at catchweight of 150 pounds. Sarasiavi debuted in an exciting fashion in Cage Warriors, but has lost 2 in a row since. The fight with Jack Claffey earlier in the year, genuinely one of the worst fights I've ever seen. If you want to see two guys striking for 15 minutes and looking like absolute dog shit, like I hate to be so critical. I'm just a guy sat on his chair podcasting, but yeah, it was horror, like one of the worst fights you'll see. But Sarasiavi, I like him a lot. Submission specialist, 3-2. Hoyen making his Cage Warriors debut, 7-4 as an amateur. Another prospect out of GB top team, and boy did Hoyen look amazing in this fight. Sarasiavi looked good late in round one, but the early stuff around one was all Hoyen. Gorgeous short elbows, framing off the clinch, like really, really good. Pressing and jabbing early, had a really clean jab. The wrestling from Sarasiavi was good. Hoyen jumped on a guillotine twice in round one, kept trying to jump that gilly and couldn't get the submission. But what I liked is that Sarasiavi is a menace on the ground, and we saw some great scrambles. We saw Hoyen playing the game there with Sarasiavi on the ground, but also managing to get the better of it a lot of the times as well, which is good to see against, like I said, a top grappler like Sarasiavi. Sarasiavi looked good in late in round one, but it was all Hoyen really. I scored it 10-9 to him. In round two, Sarasiavi came out like a house on fire, trying to punch in combination to close the distance, attempts another takedown, and that was what spelled the end for him. Hoyen jumped the guillotine. If at first you don't succeed, you keep going, you keep jumping that gilly. Dustin Poirier probably sat somewhere in Louisiana smiling to himself, not even knowing why, as Callum Hoyen pulled off the jumping guillotine finish. Gorgeous finish, really. Like had the arm out on the guillotine, beautiful pressure, managed to draw the tap. A really nice submission. Third time's a charm there for Hoyen. Another star to watch out for out of GB top team. That's a really impressive way to score your first win in your very first professional fight. So I look forward to seeing what Callum Hoyen does next. For Sarasiavi, that's 3 losses in a row. I could see Cage Warriors moving away from him, but he's fought some pretty tough opposition. It'd be interesting to see him in there again, but I don't think the appetite is going to be all the way there for him, unfortunately. So that wraps up the breakdown of Cage Warriors 180. One of the best cards of the year, in my opinion, in terms of sheer entertainment, in terms of holy shit moments, in terms of massive underdog wins, huge comeback wins, fight of the year contenders, finish of the year contenders. We had it all on this card, and to think we didn't, we missed out on a massive title fight. We missed out on pure violence between Cullen and Harilla. We missed out on a prospect showdown between Stringer and Fraser. That was a special card. Cage Warriors did really well to still keep it all together, and with 11 fights, still managed to deliver another fantastic card. Speaking of fantastic cards, we're back again next Saturday. I'll be podcasting on Sunday, no doubt, and that's due to, of course, a insane card in Newcastle where we're going to have 3 title fights. Harry Hardwick defending his featherweight title, Shaj Hack defending his flyweight title against Nicholas Oblond in what is, for me, one of the most compelling fights Cage Warriors could put on in 2024. And then we have something I've been calling out for a while, Kennedy Freeman fighting for the vacant women's bantamweight title. I really wanted this to be Kennedy Freeman and Jasmine Favero. We've not seen Favero in a while, but they bring in Mafalda Carmona, a very experienced opponent, for Kennedy Freeman. I'm sure this one's going to be a banger, no doubt. But even on the card, like we've got the return of Justin Burlinson, James Power versus Dimitri Gerlin. Like, if that's not people's main event, I don't know what is. Aiden Lee's back against Daniel Conrad. Conrad, who looked so much fun in his title fight earlier in the year. Joshua Abraham also in action. Leon Arms versus Moose Savvy. I love that fight. Charles Joyner, who, I mentioned being a bit of a dark horse for the title. If he manages to knock out Bahati in the way he's been knocking out some of his opponents recently, it could be pretty special. And a lot more fights on that one. The return of Michael Chamu as well. Cage Warriors 181 in Newcastle is going to be nuts. If it's anything like Cage Warriors 180, though, we're in for a massive, massive treat. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider liking it, reviewing it, giving a nice rating, a comment, wherever you're listening to this. Even if you're on social and you just go share it on Insta, share it on Twitter, help the podcast grow. We're the only podcast covering solely Cage Warriors. Every single card, we're here, we're doing the damn thing, and yeah, we're almost 3 years doing this, so it's quite fun, and we're building a nice audience. So yeah, if you like it, make it known that you like it. Thank you very much for listening, and I will catch you all Cage Warriors 181 in Newcastle next week.